Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bron, and on behalf of everyone at Better Read Than Dead, thank you for joining us on Zoom to celebrate Collisions, Fictions of the Future, an anthology of experimental, genre-bending stories drawn from the inaugural Liminal Fiction Prize longlist. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded, so if you prefer not to be filmed, please turn off your camera settings. Before we begin proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. These will be different depending on where you're zooming in from. For me, it's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that Better Read Than Dead is built. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, to introduce tonight's guests. We're lucky to have three of the featured writers from Collisions, Mykaela Saunders, Claire Cowell and Naima Ibrahim, joining us in conversation with Peter Politis. Claire Cowell is a writer, critic and film lover from Western Sydney. She edits Voice Works and is a member of Sweatshop Western Sydney Literacy Movement. Her work has been published in places including The Lifted Brow, SBS Voices, Rough Cut and Running Dog. Naima Ibrahim is a Sydney-based fiction writer. Naima was the winner of the 2019 Zine West Writing Awards. She was also shortlisted for the 2018 Monash Prize in Creative Writing. Her work has appeared in Sweatshop Women, Volume 1, The Little Red Thing, and Zine West 19. She is a member of Sweatshop Western Sydney Literacy Movement and was recently announced as the winner of the 2020 Heyman Mentorship Award for her debut novel. Mykaela Saunders is a writer, teacher and community researcher with occasional forays into other types of art. She is a Koori and Lebanese, working class and queer. Mykaela's work has been published across forms and disciplines and has won prizes including the 2020 Australian Book Review Elizabeth Jolly Short Story Prize for the story River Story and the 2020 Udjarul Nunukul Indigenous Poetry Prize. Tonight's moderator, Peter Politis, is a writer of Greek descent from Western Sydney. As part of the Sweatshop Writers Collective, Peter has written and performed pieces all over Australia. His first novel, Down the Hume, was shortlisted for a New South Wales Premier's Literary Award in 2017. The Pillars is his second novel. We are delighted to be able to host them all tonight. Before we get started, please note that there will be a Q&A session towards the end of tonight's event. You can type any questions you may have into the group chat and our panel will answer them via video once the time comes. Without further ado, here is Peter to introduce Naima, Claire and Mykaela.
Well, thanks to Better Read Than Dead, today I'll be interviewing three amazing writers from the publication, and I really hope I can convey my enthusiasm and also keep everyone safe during this process. This anthology is composed of stories from the 2019 Liminal Fiction Prize. It's open to Indigenous writers and writers of colour. The Fiction Prize was themed future, so some of the work plays with time, like Claire Cowell's work called See You Tomorrow, which follows an elder woman who lives in Cabra with her bubble tea wanting grandson, and she might have an interesting history of her own. And then there's Mykaela Saunders' work. This plays with the concept of future as well, which is a story about a post-colonial society where First Nations people have sovereignty over a land once known as Tweed Heads. And then there's Naima Ibrahim, whose work skips scenes and years into the future of the suburb of Auburn and documents the hostilities and conflicts of gentrification. This was actually the story that hit me the hardest, since I have seen countless suburbs being gentrified in Sydney, especially ones that were, a real heartland to the Greek community. Firstly, let's start with a question that I love asking all writers. And that question is, can you tell us about a moment? It could be a novel, a scene in a movie, a child's picture book, a cartoon, but something grabbed you and made you want to express yourself and become a writer. Claire, would you like to start?
I think my answer is when I watched Peter Pan, like the 2003 movie, when I was 6 years old, and the moment was like when she first kisses him at the end, and it's kind of like her accepting that she's gonna grow up, but he's like not gonna grow up, and I don't know. I just felt like at 6 years old, I just totally understood everything about that movie and how it was like centering this female character, and I was so overwhelmed in the cinema, and I was like, yeah, I was like this little girl, but I just felt like that film just really grabbed me, and ultimately the book did too. But I think with any like along with a lot of like stories I read at that time, now when I reflect on it, I'm like, oh, like there's so many like things wrong with those books. Like Peter Pan has like so many like major racist elements that have been discussed recently, but like I also remember that moment, just like, yeah.
So basically a young girl accepting her fate that she will age.
Yeah, that she'll age, and that she's kind of like a sexual being at like you know, and like that because like she's like and the whole thing is that she's a storyteller, and I think that was like the first time I saw a character that was a storyteller that was like around my age. Well, like she wasn't really around my age, but I think I recognized that she was a child, and I think that really, yeah, it really struck me.
Cool. Michaela, what about you?
Well, lots of things. Yeah, especially listening to like older relatives, particularly older male relatives, Lebanese and Aboriginal uncles and grandparents who just always used to tell the most loose stories, like loose, and just make us laugh so much, you know, just stuff from their younger days, but even just from last weekend. And I always love that warmth and that feeling that they kind of were able to create in just whoever was listening. And always just wanted to be a storyteller like that, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, being a raconteur, that's a skill, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, so that's that. That's not like a piece of art, but
Oh, it is, but it totally is.
It is, but not a published piece, so I can't refer to it. But I wrote a play when I was in primary school, and this was the first ever play that was directed and written by a Lebanese Aboriginal person, me. And I remember putting that on, and my friends acted in it, and it was so stupid. It was like someone shrunk and then the mum found out or whatever. But that was the kind of feeling like at assembly when everyone clapped, you know, that I thought I'm doing the same thing as my uncles are, you know.
Yeah, cool. That's actually really nice. Naima, what about you?
Mine, I don't know if I want to really admit it, but here we go. It's the Babysitters Club. Growing up as a kid, it was always my favorite series, and I feel like I've read almost the entire collection, and I feel like it was a story where I know this is weird, but I made myself a character while reading the stories. Like I was one of the babysitters and I would be on the adventures. Even though at first when I was reading it, obviously all the characters except one, obviously Claudia, were pretty much white. I still felt like, okay, this is still a story for me until they introduced the Black character. So that's when obviously I started having these ideas that, hey, people who can look like me can be in stories, but also I can be a part of it.
Yeah, that's legit. So it was the introduction of another character that made you they thought, hey, I could create. Is that fair?
Pretty much.
Yeah, cool. So let's go to a question to Michaela. Can you tell us the spark for your short story?
This one?
Yeah, in Collisions. Tell us about that.
Totally honest. This is the first short story I ever wrote, and I wrote it for a class a few years ago, my first creative writing class at Sydney University. I had a wonderful teacher called Fiona McFarlane, who's an amazing teacher and writer. And the spark for this story, our first prompt was we had to write about a place that we knew and loved. And it could be now or in the past or even in the future. And of course, I wanted to write stories set in my community in the future. So I started writing about the Terranora Estuary, which is somewhere I love. I've camped there, I've walked it, I've gone all around the waters in boats and on paddle boards. And I just wrote about all the things that happen there and how everything interacts, all the sounds and the smells, and the story just came out of there.
Yeah. But that's like going from a landscape to a piece of what would be identified in genre as science fiction, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a bit of a leap. How did you get there?
So I wrote the place, and then our second prompt for this task was to think about what kind of people are there and moving around. And of course, all the people I saw were people from my community, you know, Aboriginal people. And I saw them fishing, I saw them moving around, I saw them sitting there talking, campfires, cooking. And one of the first characters that came out of there was Skinny Kel, and who is, you know, she's like the central mystery in the story. And yeah, she just popped in, and I wrote about her and the things she did and said, and the story just grew out of there.
Okay, cool. So a character.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Naima, can you tell us about the spark for your wonderful story? You're on mute.
You did.
Sorry. It was one of those days where I had sort of something important to do, but I ended up down the YouTube rabbit hole watching random videos. It wasn't like cat videos or anything like a normal person, but it was more like mini documentaries that showed how different cities ended up with different racial demographics. And they discussed, you know, the usual topics of white flight, gentrification, and that stuff. But when it comes to issues, I'm never really interested in like facts and figures and statistics, probably why I'm not really good at opinion pieces or writing essays and stuff like that. But I immediately start imagining what it's like to live through that. What would happen? Imagine like if you're in a hometown, obviously in this story, it was Auburn, that, you know, is so rich with diversity, so rich with community. What would happen if that's all taken away, and what would that look like? So that's how I started writing that piece.
So it came as like the way you process a social issue.
Yeah.
Is like using your imagination to create an emotional narrative. Is that fair?
That's pretty much it, yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Claire, how did you tell us about yours?
So part of it I wrote as part of a workshop with Verona Gonzalez, who I think is here. But the idea, I think, came from just me wanting to write a love story. And then secondly, just like around last year-ish, like people in my family, like relatives, just started like kind of divulging things to me that like they'd like never really said before. Like not exactly what happens in the story, but just like personal information about like kind of trauma they've gone through, or like really like a really major things in their lives that like you would think I would know by now, but I think they just like now feel like I'm an adult and they can say it to me, but before it was like never said. And I just started thinking a lot about like how much is like you live with, like I live with my parents, I live with these relatives for my whole life, and I don't actually like see them as the full people they are, because they like so much of their lives are like kind of cordoned off via like immigration, or like because of like traumatic events they've been through. And so like I just see them as this person that's totally separate to like, you know, the young girl or young guy they must have been when they were like, you know, a young person, and like who has gone through the same feelings that I have. And I think that kind of intergenerational tension is really interesting to me and really complex.
So would it be fair to say that this is about you becoming aware of people not as like parental units, but as actual people?
Yeah, I think for sure. Like, I think it's a way of me trying to empathize with people I've always seen as like, yeah, like my grandma, just like someone who, you know, is like picks me up from school, or like, like just told, like, I don't know, like when I was little, when I heard stories from them, I didn't think about how they were like, you know, editing their stories until like they say something that just shifts the whole way that I've seen them. And I think, yeah, that's just my way of trying to stand in their shoes also. Yeah.
I'm gonna stay with you just for this next part because I want to talk about texts, and then we'll jump to Naima and Michaela. But in your short story, you have a lot of the use of text is very meta. In this case, books and stories play a pivotal role for the character development. Could you speak to why you use text in your short stories?
I think a part of that is just like what I just said. Like I feel like all I've learned about my like relatives and like parents and like family members past has been through their stories. And so like I really wanted that kind of energy of like storytellers and people telling their own stories and like leaving things out and changing things. So like I have that story about like how they kind of screw with like the butterfly lovers and
Yeah.
like change, like, yeah, so I like that idea of like changing things and like trying to find truth in stories. And yeah, I think that's like also I really like the idea of like relating to someone through like loving the story or like liking how they tell a story. So part of that is also that like they're bonding through the books. And the particular text I kind of referenced, like the story, like Butterfly Lovers, I just chose that because I was thinking, like, when I was like, I've been like reading a lot of like Chinese stories or like looking at like the things that my parents have told me when I was growing up, and I realized that a lot of them do have like queer themes and how but that's like completely like not acknowledged, at least in my family. And I thought that that was like an interesting tension and how it was like a really integral part of like Chinese culture, and that's also been edited out. Like in ancient China, being queer was like very common, but I think Western influence removed that. So that was just like another
Well, you
level
know,
to play with.
being Greek, I wouldn't know about queer themes in my ancient culture at all, you know.
Yeah.
Naima, let's talk about some of the text in your book. So specifically, you've deliberately written about men in Auburn, right?
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that this was a deliberate strategy so you wouldn't be identified with the characters? And so it was, and it created like a distance between you and the characters so you could use language to its fully, to render it fully so people wouldn't read this and look for you in the text?
That's a very interesting point, because that is, when I'm writing, I'm always sort of conscious about how autobiographical my writing is coming off. Obviously, because this was based in Auburn, a town that I've grown up in, I was already put a bit too much in there. So I didn't want to write from, let's say, a female hijabi Somali perspective. But the weird thing is, I know it might sound odd, but it wasn't a very conscious decision at first that I wrote to male characters. And I remember when I was writing, when I was at a workshop, and I was sort of workshopping some of the ideas there. It was actually at Sweatshop. It's a POC writers collective in Western Sydney. The very first question I was asked is, why did you write from a male perspective? And more importantly, do you think you have that sort of, let's say, the license to write from a male perspective? It was an interesting question, because when we're talking about own voices, obviously in my head, I'm always thinking about culture rather than sort of gender. When I tried to think about it, when I wrote about this story, again, I was writing Auburn. And I feel like the fact that I started writing men at first, the second I started writing Auburn, just shows how visually I feel like Auburn is a male-centric place, particularly with the coffee shops, you know, and especially with the Somali. So in my background, Somali culture, we've got this thing called Fadi Kudir. So all the Somali men, they're all, well, it used to be at Michelle's Patisserie. They used to sort of all sit around there and talk. Now that I think there are sometimes at Sweets on Queen and Oliver Brown, but basically there's this enclaves of men sitting around. So I feel like that must have influenced why I wrote from a male perspective.
Yeah, cool. That's a great answer. In terms of the text in your work, Michaela, we have this really familiar opening scene, and it's like a sci-fi trope almost, where people are preparing for a group of strangers to arrive, right? And then you subvert the whole thing. But then you also even reference Mad Max within the actual thing. Can you tell us about this trope and using this trope and essentially subverting it?
Well, the main reason I popped that reference in, you know, Mad Max and Beyonce, is because I wanted to kind of show that some time has passed, right? That was the main thing, you know. Remember, I wrote this like a few years ago. I wasn't thinking about this stuff consciously, but I did know I had to let the reader know that this was in the future. And that was a really obvious thing to me. But the reason I particularly chose Mad Max, I could have chosen anything, is the reason I wrote this story and the other stories that are going with it in this bigger collection is that I read so much Australian futurism growing up, and even, you know, recently, I've read every single bit of Australian futurism that, you know, that mentions Aboriginal people. and most of it's so racist, or they just don't include us at all, like they've genocided us, you know. And, you know, that, I just didn't like that. I just thought it was a bit rude. So I wanted to write my own, and I wanted to, you know, I wanted to play with this, you know, what Mad Max is in the world. And, you know, Australia turns into this dust bowl, and it's horrible, and it's dog eat dog, and it's just this like natural extension of late stage capital and, like, you know, survival of the fittest. And I thought, you know what, it doesn't have to be like this, because it wasn't like this for most of history. So what about a world where those kind of structures and economics come back?
Yeah, that's a wonderful response to the bleakness of science fiction and post-apocalyptic texts. You know.
Thank you.
So these questions about kind of like I want to talk about landscape a bit, and I want to go to Claire and Naima first. Claire, you rendered Cabra. Tell us how you've rendered Cabra and how easy it is to go to cliche, but you didn't. Like, do you think there's any techniques for writers to, when they're rendering an area, to not move into cliches?
I guess I did think about cliches in the sense that, like, I was aware that, like, the way Cabramatta is represented is usually, you know, junkies, alcoholics, just sensationalized crime, all that stuff. But I think the way I always approach it is just like how would a person who lived there experience it, and how, like, what would you notice, I guess, because because it's where I live, and I just feel like I just like kind of like looked at the details that I would notice walking through the street, and like someone who like actually lives there would go there with, like, you know, a very like be really mundane, these aspects, and their purpose when they visit the town isn't to, like, you know, like gawk at like shocking things. Like, everything would just be so normal and ingrained in their life. So I think I just kind of thought about, like, what the character's favorite restaurant would be, like, what are they doing in town, what are the sites, like, of activity and life. And I just kind of wanted to write about the aspects of that, of like Cabra, that felt the most familiar to me. I think that was mainly what made it feel natural. And I also did want to kind of touch on, like, gentrification, but, like, not in, I just want to, like, kind of talk about how, like, it's rapidly changed as well, because I feel like that's been something that I've noticed as well. And like Naima, I love your story, but it really resonated with me too, because I feel like the same thing has been happening where I live. And so I just wanted to, I wanted to, like, show that this character is noticing those things, because her whole life has been just things being erased and changed and, like, covered up. And I feel like that's physically happening to this new place that she's, you know, settled in as well. Yeah. So that was really rambling.
No, it's fine. It was an interesting point where you have to represent what someone would live there see, as opposed to what an outsider would see. Naima, one of the first times we've seen literally Auburn represented in literature. You talked a bit about how it's a bit of a male space.
Yeah.
Could you speak to representing the area you grew up in, I'm assuming?
Yeah, no, I would sort of echo what Claire said. It's all in the details. I feel like whenever people are trying to write about something that's clearly not their lived experience, I mean, it can be done, but when it's done wrong, the first thing that's always noticed is the cliches, the lack of detail is just sort of this generic run over kind of thing. So again, for me, the reason I started specifically on a very street, when I thought of Auburn, I thought of that 5-way intersection, because one, I'm always there because I sort of always crossing it for some reason, but it's just, for me, it was pivotal. It was Auburn because it was a very heated issue too, when it was first being made and all the construction and all of this, and sort of extend on that, get into the details, getting into what's happening, what are people eating, what's the favorite restaurants, what's the random graffiti that's written around. I know anyone who knows Auburn knows exactly the specific graffiti areas and what they're saying. So that's my advice when you're writing about place, and specifically trying to avoid the cliches, I would say.
Yeah, fair play. Michaela, let's talk about landscape in your story, right?
Yeah,
On
let's.
page 95, almost
Yep.
half of the description is landscape, which I love. I'm here for it. You know, there's this whole thing that says that like when Anglo-colonial settlers write about the landscape of Australia or America, they write it as a terrifying kind of space, a space of fear. Like that's a historical trope that's occurred in Australian literature. Whereas like, you know, in European literature, we write the land as the body. Can you speak to the way you wrote about land as giving, and actually, could you read that part for us?
Yeah, I
Would that be
can.
okay?
Should I speak about it first and then read it, or?
Please do. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I started this story by writing the place, and actually, it was a really nice way for me to start the story because all Aboriginal stories start from country, the creation of country. All of our creation stories are about that. So for me, the creation of this story was about the creation of that country, you know, in the future. And I understand, you know, I've read a lot of early Australian kind of pioneer literature, and there's so much fear in the landscape and in Aboriginal, for, you know, projected on Aboriginal people too. But, you know, and let me just backtrack a second, because, you know, we have our ghost stories too. You know, we have our, you know, what, you know, people would call an Aboriginal Gothic, where these kinds of fears are projected onto the land too. But I think that there's a different relationship to that. It's not this fear as an outsider. It's this fear that comes from like knowing what those stories are, these ancient stories that come from the land and places to go. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I can read.
Yeah, because you wrote the landscape not as a space of fear, but as a place giving to people.
Yeah, a home. You know, it's it's not, you know, it's not like a landscape that people just move on. It's not like a setting in a movie. It's a place that you live inside of, you live with, you're a part of. You know, there's no division between nature and culture. It's all like that. And even though, you know, Aboriginal people, we've been urbanized now, you know, whether we live here or, you know, where we live in the city or whatever, you know, there's still that understanding that wherever we go is country. It's all Aboriginal country, you know. Doesn't matter how built up or changed it's been. So I'm going to read from page 95. And the reason I'm reading this particular section is it's the longest section without dialogue. So just so you can get a sense of the place. The water is following its mother, the moon, over to the other side of the planet. The outgoing tide reveals acres of black seagrass, thousands of thin, shiny ribbons shimmying around underwater the way hair does. These are the fields that the catfish graze in. When Skinny Kel's board glides over them, they scatter like cowards and the seagrass parts in their wake. As she closes in on the shore, she turns away from them, hugging close to the riverbank and paddling away from camp with shorter strokes to control her direction. She peers into the trees the whole time. They wait. The light is stretching and fading, and she begins to melt into the shadows. The sun sinks down over the hills, sucking all of the light out of the estuary and pulling it all back into itself to keep under lock and key all night. Every resident of the estuary begins to sing or scratch or bark or buzz according to their own cultural protocols. Everyone is animated and singing together for today's closing ceremony. The kids emerge from the shadows and they slink onto the boardwalk, creeping towards Skinny Kel's direction. The gloaming becomes more powerful and dominates their vision, but Valmay can see Skinny Kel's bright hair up ahead at the clay banks, where a thin creek branches off the estuary. That's the place that the Christian kids used to wag school to drink grog, smoke bongs. An excavation of the clay bank shows them stuffed full of ancient brown bottles and rough plastic billies, worn smooth with time and tides. A young Christian ghost haunts this place. And I'll leave it there. And I wanted to read that bit particularly because it's sunset, and you can probably tell I'm struggling with that at the moment.
It actually looks really great. Don't change it, okay?
All right.
It's a pretty cool effect. Cool. Well, thank you for taking us to that reading. The next section of the thing after landscape for me is about asking about social order, right? I want to go to hold on, Claire. Let's talk about, feel free to pass on this, but you've rendered an emotional life of an older woman. How did you access the feelings and the emotions of an older person? And what do you think are the technicalities of doing this? Because, you know, I think you can write someone from your community. It's not a problem, even if they're a different age, but can you do it effectively? That's the question. And how does one do that?
That's really hard. Just because I don't know if I've, you know.
Did you base the character on anyone and think they respond to it?
Yes and no. Like I based it on kind of like an amalgamation of people. So I think like, I mean, I put a lot of myself in that character, but I don't like, she's also not fully me because I've not gone through this experience of being, you know, a like first generation immigrant and also living through the revolution. And and like growing up in that rural area. So a lot of that isn't like me at all, but like obviously some of the feelings, well, not so obviously, but like some like a lot of like I try to like imagine her as a person who is like this young girl that she was from the village inside, like with all these experiences built on top. Just because I realized that like you know, like the more I get to know like older people and see them as like fully formed people, and the more I age as well, I realize that like the person I was as a child is still like inside me. And so I assume that it's the same case with people who are older. And but she is like also based on like a lot of people, like so many aunts I know, the region in China that I use, like I have a really specific like a relative that I met there that was so vibrant and inspired that character a lot as well. So it is definitely like, I guess how I do it is definitely like trying to find something about the character that I find really relatable and can really empathize with, and then build kind of these traits around her, if that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Naima, can you tell us about, I've got two questions for you. The first one is, how did you construct your characters? You know, I'm asking what kind of writer you are. Do you use people you know? And do you think it's, and how did you do it for this story, basically? How did you find Yusuf in your short story?
You're muted again.
Sorry. That's a tough one. When I'm writing,
a question after as well, so go for it.
Sorry, how do I? Great. Okay, let me spend really long on this one then. When I'm writing characters, that was the question, right? How am I coming up with the characters that I write? I feel like I'm always thinking about experiences, like I sort of touched on that earlier. But characters, firstly, obviously, I'm always writing a Somali character. I mean, that's obvious. For me personally, that decision is made because I never got to see Somali writers, Somali characters in writing for a very long time. It's not until I specifically started Googling, Somali writers, Somali books. And it was a pretty disappointing Google search, by the way. It was a lot of the cliched, war-torn countries kind of stuff. But I have that in mind because I want to represent my people. But I'm always trying to avoid and be conscious of the fact that I'm not writing to, let's say, racism or political issues. I want to get characters that are living the lived experiences, sort of diverse lived experiences of Somali people. One tweet that always stands out for me was Mumtaza Mehri. She's this Somali poet who just sort of tweeted out a link, and it had a list of various different Muslims in this case that had written different films, novels, projects, and almost, I would say a large percentage of them were either directly or indirectly linked to 9/11 rhetoric or some kind of inner turmoil of being a Muslim in a Western nation. And I don't want to do the same thing with my characters, only because I feel like it pigeonholes you into a box, and you sort of you're writing as an other. There's so many things wrong with it, basically. So again, that's what I'm thinking about when I'm writing my characters. Trying to think of the nuances of life that I experience is not just specifically the politics of my life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. But you do something quite amazing in your short story, and that is you kind of identify a really specific cultural phenomena where a person of color and a white person meet. And whenever the whiteness person is engaged, they become snarky, aggressive in that context because you're labeling them with a cultural identity, right? And that is a really specific thing, right? Because people of color are allowed to have their cultural references brought up and discussed and talked about. But when you do it, when you engage people on their whiteness, they become defensive, right? They wipe their hands of it. How did you get to that point and how did you identify that?
Sorry, what was the?
How did you identify that and then decide to represent it in your story?
I think it's just calling it out, or it's just writing exactly what white culture is and not shying away from the word white. Again, that's a very specific thing. I had to learn to do that again in sweatshop circles. I feel like when I was first writing, I did not want to write that. I felt like, oh, that's an offensive word, not really thinking about why that was offensive. And then we had these discussions in our circles and sort of discussions that I have with other writers about, no, you just call it out. It's not really on you to sort of censor yourself so other people feel comfortable, kind of thing. Like, you need to start owning the space and owning what you're writing. So I feel like that was just a learned experience of just writing exactly how I see it and not censoring that.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, you've represented a phenomena that we're all intimately aware of.
Yeah.
That could be that phenomenon could be its own book, like the way white tees, brown scars is. Would you like to read part of your short story and tell us which part you're going to read now?
No problem. So the part I'm going to read is when Yusuf first realizes that he's got a new shop neighbor. Tuesday, 30 June, 2026. Yusuf walked through the plaza to the barbershop across from his office. Hassan had texted earlier to say he couldn't make their meeting, so he decided to get a haircut. The barbershop was one of the few other plaza stores that had survived the recession. He sat in an empty chair. A Turkish hits program was blaring from the TV in the corner. Hanging above the mirror was a red and yellow Galatasaray scarf, the favorite soccer team of Mehmet. There's another one, Yusuf said to him. Mehmet didn't respond immediately. He threw a black cape around his neck and turned on the clippers. Just last week, they had looked on in shock, eyebrows raised, as a yoga studio opened across the plaza. I know. I see a new barbershop open as well. In Yahya Ol Kebab shop. Yusuf's short curls began falling onto the tiles. It's getting a bit weird round here, Yusuf said. This morning I see Hassan help someone move next to you, Mehmet said. What were they selling? Yusuf asked. It looked like fruit and vegetables. That's normal, at least. Back at the plaza, Yusuf could see Hassan at the shop neighboring his, helping a white man move into the store. The only white people that lived around here were the tab regulars. At least that was the case 5 years ago. This man didn't look like one of them. Yusuf watched him as he scrunched his blonde hair into a man bun. He wore ripped jeans and Converse shoes. Hassan was helping him move wooden shelves into the store. The storefront sign read, Auburn Whole Foods. The white man thanked Hassan before waving him goodbye. He spotted Yusuf and walked up to him, an oversized grin on his face. Hey mate, how are you? He reached his arm out for a handshake. I'm Nick. Nick what? Yusuf asked. Nick Johnson. There aren't many Johnsons around here. Nick Johnson paused, his smile fading a little. What you selling? Yusuf asked. My friend and I noticed there weren't any organic stores nearby, so we opened this place up. He beamed at the store like he was selling Ferraris and not fruit. Nobody here wants to buy organic food, they grow their own. Really? Haven't seen that. He looked around the plaza like he owned all of it. People are time poor nowadays, and people change. People get replaced. I'll leave it at there.
Yeah, people do get replaced. So I grew up in Belmore, and to me, the first step of gentrification is not an organic fruit shop, but actual artists coming into the community. That's the first step. The assumption of that is that we don't have our own artists in the community. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Right. I want to jump to another discussion, right? And I want to talk about class. I will ask you all questions about class in your stories and social and economic class. But Mykaela, at the core of your work is tenderness and humans caring for the less fortunate. It's a First Nation community showing the care and respect for an outsider that was denied to them during colonisation. Do you think your work is a moral story about taking care of the less fortunate?
I mean, it definitely didn't start out that way, but I think these things creep in because that's, you know, these are the things that, this is my culture and these are the things that we talk about. But of course there are characters in the story who don't want to look after the old woman because, you know, so I didn't want to show Aboriginal people as this kind of nice, saviour, heroic, sweet, kind of homogenous group, because that's not true, you know. We have different opinions on things in our communities. We have different ways of looking at things, different ways of imagining, you know, who we should be looking after and why. And to bring it back to your kind of your, you know, if you wanted to talk about class, I you know, just through my studies of, you know, studying different cultures and, you know, throughout history, I've really come to believe that pre-contact Aboriginal cultures was, you know, some of the most egalitarian. You know, everyone was a worker and everyone helped each other and everyone had responsibilities and rights within their relationships. And I wanted to see if I could write a story where that was true again in my community. And yeah, and with that comes care and tenderness, right? Because when you're related to so many people, you know, for those of you who don't know, Aboriginal kinship structures are so different to Western kinship, you know, have more than one mum, more than one dad, and a lot of aunties and uncles and siblings. And within these relationships, you have these rights and responsibilities. And, you know, if you're related to all these different people in different ways, you know, you have all these different ways of relating, and a lot of that is in a caring way, whether that's affectionate or platonic or sexual, romantic or economic or whatever. But yeah, I just wanted to show that in this story.
That's there was a lot of conflict in the story, and I thought that showed us a different the conflict in the communities that exist in all communities, and you know, I think that well done, Claire.
Yeah.
So the relationship between Lu Swan and Rulian, there's caste conflict, right? Because under the banner of cultural diversity, many people focus merely on race and not the nuances of the social orders in the communities. Could you speak to that?
That's like a sound. Yeah. Oh, something about your microphone. Yeah, I think class is always going to be like quite an important part of everything I write, just because, you know, I grew up in a working class family, and I think, like, other than race, like, class is a huge kind of factor. Just like I think, like, yeah, people do assume that, like, if you're from the same race, there's some kind of like unspoken solidarity, but I think just like, especially like since I started entering kind of university, like, I felt really alienated from like people of the same race because they're from different class backgrounds, and like I did kind of want to represent that, like, even in like a room, like, even if you have feelings to someone or you have that kind of like connection to someone, if you're from different class upbringings, there can be like real tension with yeah, just like a sense of, I think with the Li Xuan character, I did also want to like convey how she feels like some things are just going to be like out of reach forever, and that she'll never have the freedom to like access them. And in that sense, like, the class is also a factor because she feels like, you know, she has so much responsibility to like her family and like her grandson, and has to like support him and like prioritize those relationships. So like that's kind of like been her whole life. Whereas Rulian, like, even though she does also struggle with like the, like, you know, not being able to be herself, she was able to kind of live a comfortable life despite that, because of her money and because of her ability, like the mobility of money, and being able to move away and to kind of, you know, So yeah, I think it was also about that, like how, like, you know, how not having money can sequester you and can make you feel trapped, and like how that affects your psychology, basically.
Which is a real thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
When you're from a certain background. Is there an echo or is that just me, guys?
Yeah, there's an echo before.
Okay. I have another thing. Naima, let's talk about class in your piece, because everyone in your story is entrepreneurial. They're small business owners, which is not usual for when we think of minority communities representatives. We think of like factory workers and cleaners and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Could you speak to this?
Sorry?
Could you speak to kind of deliberately choosing someone from a mercantile community to?
Yeah, no, definitely. And you're exactly right. A lot of the times with migrant characters, it's always sort of the working class, which again, there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's the only narrative, it's sort of building a sort of really a fake narrative, really. Especially when it comes to migrants, I feel like migrants are so drawn towards having a small business. I feel like even if you look at a lot of the migrant community in Western Sydney, if you walk down any sort of street, it's all small businesses run by migrants. And I say migrants specifically because I feel like migrant communities think that the ticket to financial freedom, I think even Claire was touching sort of the nobility of money is always having that small business, having your own money, not working for someone else. I'm also thinking specifically of Somali women, my aunties, especially my mother. They're always thinking about a million different ways to make money, and it's always like business. It's always like, we should do this, we should open this, we should run this. And I feel like it's a very unique thing with migrants that's not often touched on.
Yeah, right. It's such a big thing. We never talk about it.
Yeah.
It's huge. Let's move on to the next section, which is going to kind of take us to an ending. But I want to ask you all about love, specifically. Claire, could you read us a section from your short story?
Sure.
You know, because, you know, you have to write about Rulian and Luswan, and you have to love them in a way. You have to love these characters. Could you tell us which part you're going to read and go through it?
Sure. I'm just gonna read you the part when they say goodbye after reuniting after like a few decades, and yeah, I'll just read it. It's just basically Lee Shuren kind of like reflecting on like how much has changed and how much is still the same in terms of her feelings, and how like her grandson, and like how relationships can shift so drastically. Like her grandson is currently, like, if anyone hasn't read it, like her grandson who came out to his parents has been kicked out of his house and is now living with her. So that's like another thing. Okay, I'll read it. Eventually, all Sims came to an end, as did Yamcha. Li Xuan and Rulian went through the motions. They squabbled over the bill and inquired about the others' plans for the rest of the day, before surmising that both parties were busy. They stepped on the escalator again, rode it all the way down, and began a slow trundle on the train to the train station, not saying much at all. Li Xuan was slowly giving in to a creeping sense of acceptance. What had she expected? 50 years was a long time by anyone's standards. A temporal realm where whole communities sprung up from the dirt and stretched their arms towards the sun. And yet, wherever she looked, she saw what she was losing. There, 2 blocks down, lay a store selling $15 pinstripe suits and tubs of discounted school shoes. Years ago, when her daughter was still a preteen, the lot belonged to a Malaysian family that sold Apam Balik. Those days were gone, those moments of her daughter licking batter from her fingers as her husband hummed along to the shop's pop tunes. There at the sharp corner turn was where Nathan had once tripped as a child, smashing his nose hard against a signpost. His mother had stroked his cloudling tufts of hair, holding his head in one hand as she wiped at his nose with the other. That tenderness had been entombed by time as well. Li Xuan and Rulian were prepared to part at the traffic light. Quickly, Li Xuan committed this new Rulian to her memory, the strands of hair wisping into her mouth, the wrinkles clustered around her blank gaze. She was glad to know Rulian at this stage, even if she was a stranger, glad to know that she had survived and would go on surviving. When she opened her mouth to say goodbye, something of Rulian seemed to give away, her jaw clenching so tight that it seemed her teeth would grind through nerve. I planned to say so many things to you today, and said none, Rulian said, her wild tone reminding Li Xuan of the girl that had recklessly sliced her way through a darkened lake. Words are difficult, Li Xuan said. Say them even if they're silly. This seemed to be the wrong response. Rulian looked even more frustrated. All I want to say, she said, shaking her head, is see you tomorrow. Does that make any sense to you? No, it doesn't, Li Shun said, and they both began to laugh. That's the end.
Yeah, wonderful. What a way to end. Like there's a big emotional development in this like banal setting filled with the characters' memories, and then a zoom in on the face of the person, and then we have this whole awkward ending that is characteristic of their relationship.
Yeah.
You know, it's. Do you love those characters?
I do. I think I think out of everything I've written, they've really stuck with me, even though like they're the most different to me. Like usually I write people my age, very close to me in like terms of age, background, gender, like yeah, everything. So like, but these two women are so different to me, and yeah, I feel so like tender towards them. Yeah.
Literature is like an abundance of like intercultural, and when I say intercultural relationships, I mean like white male, Asian female relationships, right? There's just too much of it, right? And I think Claire, like, and I'm sure everyone that's read the story would be like, well, you know, you should be encouraged to turn this into a bigger piece, you know what I mean? To explore these characters more fully, and you shouldn't be scared of that. And I think, you know, reading this story, you're probably ready to do that.
Yeah, I would love to. Like, I was thinking like if I was ever to do that, I would really want to go back to like China as well and Kunming specifically because I was writing it from my childhood memories as well. So I feel like I really do want to like spend time there and like really understand the characters more. So yeah. Yeah.
Naima, you know, in your story, these men, they love their community. They're betrothed to, you know, the coffee shops, and they're betrothed to the plaza, and they help people around them. Who do you love in your community at the moment?
Who do I love?
And what I mean by that is I think those people, your characters, parallel a love for where they grew up. Do you know what I mean? Can you access that as well?
Oh, definitely, especially when it comes to place, and especially that sort of mixture that we see in Auburn. I feel like even though it's normal to have like a love-hate relationship with the places that we're from or the communities that we're from, but I feel like ultimately the love comes out. I feel like it's no one really gets you, or I don't know. I feel like I should let me think about it. I feel like you feel connected even despite the flaws, even if you sort of have a clash. I feel like in our community, when people have their headbutts, I feel like even if it can last for years, you still have that connection that we're in this sort of together. We understand each other. We're sort of the others. We know each other in this sort of larger landscape of where the inferior, I don't want to use the word inferior, but in the wider context of Australia, I feel like we're the minority.
There is like a solidarity between
That's the word I was looking for.
understanding your role in the social structure. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And that's the building block of that love, you reckon?
Definitely.
Okay, that's nice. Michaela, the sun has set where you are.
I'll pop the lamp on, maybe.
Nice cover. You show us love for the community and love for the vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go personal with you. Who do you love the most at this moment in your life?
My partner.
Yeah.
Yes. My family, my friends. I don't know. I find it really hard to like hierarchize who, you know, my relationships. Everyone is so important to me and has been. And even the people who might not be immediately important to me right now, they have been for a long time. And I can't prioritize the here and now over what might have been a formative love and care for me. You know, my best friend lives overseas. We haven't hung out for a long time. We don't talk a lot, but that love, even though that's not immediate, that sustains me still, you know, and it will in the future. So just everybody really, like, I know that probably
in your work, when you constructed this ornate social order in your writing, right? there's kind of like a love for a stranger? Do you think that's fair? And the social order needs to be contested so that love can be put to the test. Is that fair?
I mean, I think it's fair on a reading of it, but again, I can't think too much into it because I wrote it like as a prompt, and you know, it is what it is. It became what it was, but I didn't consciously, you know, think about these things. You know what I mean? But yeah, look, I think if you're talking specifically about Skinny Kel's kind of love for this old woman, you know, they were incarcerated together, and you know, for those of us who know about, you know, what institutionalization does to people, those bonds can be really strong, and even when the incarceration isn't there anymore, those bonds are really you know, these kind of trauma bonds that get you through. And I think that's what was going on with them. And Skinny Kel, obviously, she grew up out of culture, out of community. She probably didn't have many old people around, so she just feels this affection and this kind of responsibility to this old woman who isn't, you know, she can't look after herself. And Skinny Kel probably sees in her, or she's probably looking after her the way she would have really liked to be looked after in her vulnerable moments, but she didn't have anyone there for her, you know.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so I was thinking now, would you guys be up for taking audience questions?
Yeah, bring it.
If you want to go through the group chat, everyone in the meeting, or you want to send it directly to me, please go through. I'll prioritize any questions. I'll take 1 minute standing to see if we have any questions.
Don't think we have any so far.
No, we haven't. I haven't seen any on the chat. But yeah, feel free to type up some questions. And comments. As we're doing that, I really want to thank Leah and Tigni for organising this event.
Yeah.
Thank you, Leah, so much for that.
Yep.
A big thank you to Better Read Than Dead. Thank you for hosting us. We're really, really appreciative. And I kind of hate that I can't do this in person, you know, because I just kind of miss being in the space with human bodies and
Yes.
outfit that goes, you know, that includes pants, you know what I mean? Like, and of course, again, we've got a question here, but I would like to thank everyone at Liminal and the group at Liminal and all those involved, and the wonderful editors of this publication, who are Leah Jean McIntosh, Shirtan, Adalia Nash Hussain, Hassan Abdul. Adalia would like to ask, let's talk about reading. What have Mykaela, Naima, Claire read anything good lately?
Yes, I've just finished The Vanishing Half by Britt Venet.
I read that too.
It's incredible. I fell in love with her debut novel, The Mothers, which was really good, but I feel like this has really outdone itself. And I seriously recommend everyone grab it if they haven't already. What
is good about it?
It's the writing. I love the way that she sort of brings such depth and such emotion and life into these characters, and has you sort of feeling for characters, even if, I mean, if you had described it to before, so one of the characters, this isn't like a spoiler, but one of the characters is a Black person, but because it's sort of set in the sort of 50s, 60s, she's white passing, and she eventually decides that she's going to be white. So she sort of escapes her family and poses as a white woman. And I was confronted at that at first, but the way she sort of writes this character, it makes you sort of understand the decisions she makes.
Cool.
Can I ask what that book was again?
The Vanishing Half.
See, I was actually going to mention one of two books, but one book that I read in the last few months is called Boy Snow Bird by Helen Oyeyemi.
Also similar, yeah.
Right. She's also talking about, you know, the experience of being black and white passing and stuff. And she's, her writing's amazing. It's so delicious. I love it. Yeah, all right, cool. So another one that talks about this thing.
Never-ending list.
I haven't been reading much lately, to be honest, but I recently read Luster by Raven Leilani. Have you guys heard of that book? It's kind of like, I mean, like it's been labeled like a millennial novel because it's about like a young woman working in publishing, and like she has like kind of like millennial issues, but I feel like her prose is just like amazing. Like I think it's like kind of like the freshest prose I've read ever. Like she has like sentences that are so surprising, and that like each sentence is just like, yeah, like her metaphors and like the language she uses is just like really fresh. And also I think because like she's a black writer, and like she I've never read like a book, like a millennial, kind of like a popular millennial novel about like a young woman that's like about a black woman as well. And I feel like that brings another dimension to it, and it's not like tokenistic or anything, but she kind of like has these like common tropes that have been big in contemporary lit, but you know, they have these new depth because she's like talking about how it interacts with blackness and like how it means to be black in the publishing industry as well. That's like the first half of the book. I think the second half kind of like goes off the rails, but then I think it's really worth it for like just the freshness of her voice. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Can I also mention another book? I read Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor, who's it was translated from Mexican. She's originally Mexican. It was translated into English. And it's probably not everyone's cup of tea, but I loved it. It was really heavy and hard to read and horrible. But yeah, the narration and the story just so, I don't know, I just really love that kind of stuff. Just that, you know, I like heavy stuff, you know. Hurricane Season.
The content was hard, or?
Sorry, say that again.
The content hard, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it deals with all the isms and the phobias and the philias, but you know, these are stories that you know, these are things that happen. So you know, I like really heavy stories, and that's one of them.
Yeah, cool. So no, that's cool.
Yep.
Well, I think we're going to wind down now, and I might throw it back to Better Read Than Dead. Michaela, Naima, Claire, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You.
To be interviewed by you. Next time I'll be a lot harsher to you.
Bring it.
Okay. Lovely to meet you all. I can't wait to see you as human beings in the real world.
Yeah, it'd be nice. That'd be nice.
Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and thanks to the panel. What a fabulous conversation. And I put the link to buy Collisions in the chat, so please don't hesitate to get in touch and get your copy. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Liminal.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.